Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elsom, and The Independent's political correspondent, Zoe Grünewald. Welcome to both of you, with us from now until just before midnight, I know. So to the front pages, let us start with the Eye. Mounting pressure on the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, to deliver tax cuts in the next budget, according to the Eye. The Guardian also highlights the Chancellor's financial plans, with experts from the IFS telling them that any case he has for tax cuts is weak. Financial Times front page, Sweden clears its last hurdle to join NATO as Putin's war shifts the alliance's borders. The Metro leads with the sentencing of so-called cat killer Scarlett Blake, who's been jailed for life for murdering Jorge Martin Carreño in Oxford. The Daily Mirror reports that around 100 children per day are falling victim to sextortion scams. The Telegraph reveals that the Ministry of Defence has been forced to suspend a new military accommodation plan amid a huge backlash from army wives over its rules. Meanwhile, The Sun reports on Friends star Courtney Cox possibly joining a celebrity spin-off series of BBC's hit TV show The Traitors. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers for yourself while listening to our guests. So let's head straight to them. The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elsom, and The Independent's political correspondent, Zoe Grünewald. Welcome to you. So, Lee Anderson, shall we kick off? Your paper, amongst others, then Zoe, leading on this, and the ramifications for the Conservative Party.
Yes, so this is going back to Lee Anderson's comments over the weekend about Islamists, about Sadiq Khan, and, of course, Rishi Sunak's comments today where he wouldn't call the comments Islamophobic. He said they were wrong. He defended his decision to suspend Lee Anderson, but kind of wouldn't use that phrase that a lot of his colleagues are now calling for him to use. Obviously, those within the Labour Party as well are calling it Islamophobic, racist. But the PM has stopped just short of saying that, which has raised questions about how seriously the party takes this issue and why they're not willing to use that language.
Yeah, talk us through about Lee Anderson. You know, one of those politicians to reach parts of the electorate that the rest of the Conservative can't. Used to be a Labour councillor, of course, so he's already flip-flopped a bit, hasn't he, in terms of his political allegiances. Do they need his voice? Or, you know, beyond what he said now, you know, is that part of the party they still need to support, do you think?
Oh, definitely. And, you know, Lee Anderson has sort of become known as the Red Wall Rottweiler. And when he was appointed as Rishi Sunak's deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, I think the idea is that he could sort of speak in a language in which Rishi Sunak potentially couldn't. You know, he sort of sounded like people who come from the Red Wall. He's an ex-miner. He's a bit more strident with his views than Rishi Sunak. And he's sort of actually quite a useful outrider for the Prime Minister and for the Tory party. The problem is, as Robert Buckland said earlier, is that if you have an attack dog, don't be surprised if it ends up biting you on the hand. And I think that's exactly what's happened. He has gone too far with his comments in the eyes of the Prime Minister and the eyes of a lot of people. The question is now, what do you do about it? Because he's suspended, and it's almost as if the decision to suspend him was the easy part. The decision now is whether or not you end up re-admitting him before the election, and that is a choice which Rishi Sunak is going to have to make. And he's in a bit of a bind now, because if he doesn't re-admit him, then potentially you're going to get pincer movements like Reform eating into that vote if you don't think you're taking what Lee Anderson's saying seriously. But obviously, if you do admit him back into the party, you're going to open yourselves up to allegations that you're not taking Islamophobia seriously.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that comes from this. One, you know, should the policing of these pro-Palestinian marches be done better? Two, will he join Reform? And what does that mean electorally for the Conservative Party, do you think?
Yeah, so, I mean, to the Reform point, we know that Reform is actually starting to nibble away quite significantly at the Conservatives' vote share. We saw this a little bit in the recent by-elections in Wellingborough. And even the by-election this week in Rochdale, we're seeing that the Reform Party might well be quite a considerable challenger. I'm not sure they're going to actually win, but they are definitely talking about this sort of vote share that they'll be able to pick up. So there's definitely concerns from the Prime Minister.
Well, and their candidates receive threats, I think, hasn't there?
Yes.
Richard Tice has, you know, put in a formal, you know, complaint or whatever you call it to police about that. So, yeah, sorry, Zoe, continue.
Well, and Rochdale's a perfect example of this, where actually these kind of discussions around anti-Semitism, around Islamophobia have really come to a head. And this has been quite a major part of some of the campaigning, some of the issues in Rochdale. And what we're seeing now is actually two challenger parties, the Workers' Party, headed up by George Galloway, and Reform by Simon Danczuk. They're actually far more likely, I think, to be contenders for that seat than the traditional parties, Labour, the Conservatives, because both of them, and indeed the Green Party as well, have all failed to kind of root out these issues within their party, within their candidates there.
Well, the Times is just in. I'm proof that Britain isn't racist, says Sunak. Rishi Sunak has declared that I can't read it with my glasses on, obviously. That's too far away. He is living proof that Britain is not a racist country as he sought to contain a growing row over Islamophobia. The point is that, they have taken action. Is that enough, do you think? Or will people want investigations into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party at least opened, which is what we hear from Saeed Avasi, for example?
Yeah, well, those are certainly the calls starting to bubble up in the Conservative Party now, and I'm sure they will be taking that seriously. It's interesting, isn't it, with this word Islamophobia? Why is the Prime Minister and senior ministers almost refusing to use this word? I think one is probably political, and they don't want clips before the election of them talking about Islamophobia because it sort of embeds this idea that there could be a problem. But also, it's interesting the point that Kemi Badenoch made yesterday on Twitter, where she says that we refer instead to Islamophobia as anti-Muslim hatred. And because if you adopted Labour's definition, you'd almost be saying that this religion is beyond reproach. And she is saying that you would create blasphemy laws by the back door. And so I think that if that is the reasoning which the Conservatives are giving for dodging this word almost, they need to make that point a bit stronger, because at the moment I'm not sure most of the public will be too au fait with that.
Yes, and Suella Braverman in the Telegraph condemning as hysteria this row about Islamophobia. So, it's again yet another thing that splits the party. While, Labour's had its own issue about anti-Semitism in Rochdale, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, this is an entirely predictable intervention, I think, from Suella Braverman. I mean, she actually wrote an op-ed earlier in the week talking about this same kind of issue. And it's very interesting that Braverman has made very similar comments. But it's Lee Anderson who has been suspended from the party. And Suella Braverman obviously remains in place. And she's a very powerful figure on the right of the party. We know she had quite a lot of control when she was Home Secretary. And that when she was forced out the role, that was quite a significant point in Sunak's premiership. So absolutely, we can see Braverman is wading in here, and she's kind of defending some of those comments and the right to kind of critique Islam. But I think, going back to what Jack said, I mean, there clearly is an issue here, which is when does criticisms or questions about religion become obviously quite clearly problematic. And I think it's very, very hard to argue that the comments that Lee Anderson made weren't entirely offensive, weren't Islamophobic, weren't, very, very unpleasant, and shouldn't have been said by someone who's not only an MP, but someone who was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. And we've seen that the Prime Minister has been willing to distance himself from those comments, but stopping short, as Jack said, from actually using the word Islamophobic.
OK, we'll move on to the budget, shall we? In the papers, not surprising. Just over a week to go, although we all get confused in February because it's such a short month, don't we? Anyway, experts warn Hunt over this dubious case for unfunded budget tax cuts. So is he in a pickle, and what's likely to happen? Yeah,
and it is the worst-kept secret in Westminster, and in fact probably the world now, that they are going to be cutting taxes at the budget. They see it as a pre-election gift, and hopefully they can woo some voters over. The question now is by how much they can cut these taxes. And the IFS, in a briefing earlier, made the point that they have very, very limited scope to do so unless they're going to take a massive chunk out of public services as well. And it is this constant tussle between public services or tax cuts. And I think that at the moment the Tories in a bit of a bind with this one because, they have to placate a lot of people, Tory MPs, who want them to cut taxes. Obviously, taxes, the tax burden is at the highest since the Second World War, and so they are massively under pressure to do that. However, if they do that at the expense of public services, once again, they're going to open themselves up to allegations of austerity 2.0. They're not funding things properly, and so it's very difficult for the Chancellor. But I think that we're going to see him try and cut taxes here. One, because he has to show that he's getting that tax burden down. But two, I think that he could probably invest billions into public services and wouldn't get that much credit for it because people don't feel it at the moment. Potentially, the argument is if you go for tax cuts before the election, people might actually feel it in their pockets.
Yes, and the junior doctor strike's still underway as well. So, that has ramifications for the health service. And depending which paper you read, depends whether they want to see more spending on public services or they want tax cuts. The Eye is also leading on this. Hunt has 6 days to find tax cuts to save Tory MPs. The Tory MPs where exactly in their constituencies?
Well, there's a number, it's quite a vocal portion of Conservative MPs who are calling for Rishi Sunak to bring down down the tax burden. And I think Jack's absolutely right in that people aren't feeling well off, not just because of the tax burden, but also because public services are really not functioning adequately. And the IFS's report basically says if you do choose to use this money to create tax cuts, then public services are going to suffer. And it's not going to be the ring-fence public services like the NHS, it's going to be courts, it's going to be higher education, it's going to be local councils, all these things that are absolutely at breaking point. We know the court backlog is 2 years at the minute. So
council taxes are going up 4.99%, just under the 5% that requires a local referendum.
Precisely. And, people might think, oh, it's great, I've got 50 quid in my pocket this month extra. But if you can't get an NHS appointment, if you can't, if everything else around you seems to be falling apart, you don't feel better off.
So what do Sun readers want then, out of interest?
I think they want the tax burden to come down. I think at the moment there's hardly any difference really between Labour and the Tories in their economic policy, from what I can see anyway. You have sort of window dressing around Labour wanting to clamp down on non-doms and VAT in private schools, but it doesn't actually raise a certain amount of money, right? It's pretty much chicken feed in the grand scheme of things. And I think that a lot of people are feeling that they are being absolutely squeezed to the pipsqueaks when it comes to tax at the moment. And so things which are actually going to make a difference to people's lives, so personal taxes, whether you're talking about income tax, national insurance, fuel duty, these are all the sort of things that Jeremy Hunt will be putting in the mix before the budget on March 6th.
VAT? No.
Potentially VAT, you're talking about growth,
Yeah, absolutely. Financial Times now. Just checking which one we're doing. This is about James... Well, it says Sweden here, doesn't it? Oh, right, front. NATO, sorry. Yes, Sweden clears the last hurdle to join NATO. It's taken, about 600 days, is it, for Hungary to approve this?
So lots of kind of congratulations on social media tonight from the Defence Secretary and all kinds of politicians who are very happy to see that Sweden have finally been allowed to join NATO. As you said, Hungary was holding that up for some time. And obviously this is really significant. We're at a really key point here. We're not only is Putin's invasion of Ukraine really kind of ramping up, we're talking about the future of relations in Europe, and of course also potential presidential candidate Donald Trump is talking about America's future in NATO. So it's sort of more important than ever that the allyship looks really, really strong. And I think people will be very pleased to see that Sweden, which is this really kind of geographically important part of Europe in terms with its Russian border, is now protected and joining forces with the rest of NATO.
OK, we'll come to your story after the break. And also, on the front of The Sun, which claims that Friends star Courtney Cox is potentially being lined up as the first signing for the celebrity version of The Traitors. Back in a moment. Well, welcome back. Heading to the press preview in just a moment. Just quickly, some breaking news. Joe Biden, about to go into TV studios, has said that he hopes to have a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Gaza by next week. It's a political visit to New York on Monday. He said he hopes to have the ceasefire in place by March the 4th. So that is next week. We will bring you more on that and possibly even envision those comments from him. So hopes of a ceasefire coming early next week, the words there of the US president. So let's return to Sky Papers then and bring in The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elsom, and The Independent's political correspondent, Zoe Grünewald. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to your story in The Sun, shall we, which is James Cleverly talking about an international crackdown on illegal immigration. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, is going to be making a big speech tomorrow about migration. Viewers might be a bit confused that he's making it in the US, in New York. Why is that? Well, that's because he's sort of banging the drum for an international approach to tackling migration as he sees it. So it's not just about stopping these small boats coming over here, which is sort of the sharp end of the migration crisis, but he's talking about more returns deals with other countries. He's talking about more intelligence sharing. He's talking about trying to stop it, as he sees it, upstream. So not just boats coming across the channel, but the actual overall flow of migration, which comes often through the Middle East and then across Europe. He's trying to stop it upstream. So it's interesting he's going to New York to make this speech. He's also hailing the Rwanda plan as a world beater and saying that Britain is pioneering this sort of deportation scheme. Obviously, at the moment, that is being gummed up in the House of Lords. We haven't sent a single person to Rwanda yet. But it's interesting how he's already trying to sort of position the UK as a country which potentially should be followed. Obviously, we've had a lot of problems with the Rwanda plan, and no one's going to doubt that. But, yeah, it's interesting how he's making that speech over there tomorrow.
Quick look at The Guardian, Zoe. Labour would help schools train young male influencers to counter the likes of Andrew Tate.
Yeah, so the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has said that to combat sexual harassment, Labour want to see schools develop role models to provide a counterbalance to people like Andrew Tate, who is an influencer who's known for his very misogynistic views on social media. It's a really interesting proposal. It's part of a lot of Labour's plans to kind of toughen up mental health provision in schools, to toughen up provision to have better guidance for young people, and to basically improve schools and the education that children receive in a kind of holistic way as well. And clearly misogyny in schools is a big issue. I mean, you only have to talk anecdotally to teachers, especially female teachers, to talk about the sort of misogyny they're experiencing. We've seen a real spread of it because of people like Tate on social media. Whether this will work is really interesting. You have to think about the resources teachers have to kind of teach young men. You have to think about whether it'd be better placed, this kind of work with campaigners.
I'm waving at you because we've run out of time. I just want to show the last story, which is The Sun. I do apologise. Friends and Traitors, all-star show wants Courtney Cox. Apparently a pal of host Claudia Winkleman appeared with her on a sketch for the show as well. So we'll wait and see, shall we? Got a line on that very quickly?
The Traitors is probably one of my favourite shows of the past few years. I must admit, I've never seen Friends, so I'm not quite sure who Courtney Cox is.
Extraordinary, yeah.
If it's The Traitors, it's going to be fantastic.
OK, so, yeah, the youth of today. See you both later. Thank you. Here's the weather.